Today is June 13th, 2003. We're on board the Battleship New Jersey preparing for an oral history interview.
And where were you born?
Dayton, Ohio.
In what year?
1944.
And tell me about your experiences driving down from Boston today.
It was a rainy day and I was a little sleepy after
Hello, my name is Dr. Tom Bennett. I'm from Kean University and I'm with the Battleship New Jersey Oral History Program. Today is June 13th, 2003. I'm talking today with Mr. Paul Stillwell, who served aboard the battleship as a lieutenant in 1992?
69.
From 20 May 1969 to 15 October 1969, where he served as the Assistant Combat Information Center Officer. Mr. Stillwell also went on to become the oral historian for the
U.S. Naval Institute.
U.S. Naval Institute. Paul, thank you very much for talking with us today.
I'm delighted to be here.
Let's start off the conversation. Tell us, how'd you get to become involved with the Battleship New Jersey?
In the fall of 1968, I was serving on board an LST, USS Washoe County. We were off the coast of Vietnam, and I had been following in the news reports the progress of the New Jersey when she'd been pulled out of mothballs at Philadelphia, modernized, reactivated, sent over to the Western Pacific and Vietnam to bombard, and certainly attracted my attention, and I followed her. And some of the slow watches on board the Washoe County, I would look through books that had pictures of battleships in them, and that stirred my imagination even more. So I put in a request to the Bureau of Naval Personnel in the fall of '68 to get duty on board New Jersey. And my captain, Vern Smith, gave it a favorable endorsement. And I think it was the 2nd of January, 1969, I put through a call from Yokosuka, Japan, to my detailer in the Bureau of Personnel. And there was a hearty voice on the other end of the line. He said, "Looks like we've got a job for you on the wagon." And I was just overjoyed because that could mean only one thing, the Battleship New Jersey. So a few weeks later, during a break from her time on the gun line in Vietnam, the New Jersey came into Yokosuka for a little R&R for the crew. And I went aboard and looked up Lieutenant Dick Harris because I had been subscribing to our hometown newspaper from Springfield, Missouri, and saw that a fellow from our town was on board, and he was most hospitable. We became friends at that point. He showed me around the ship, gave me a much more thorough tour than I suspect many would have had, and that built my excitement even more. A postscript to that, last year in 2002, went back to Springfield, Missouri to help my dad celebrate his 90th birthday. And on the evening of his birthday, we went out to a restaurant. My brother Mark pointed out Dick Harris across the room, so went over and had a reunion with him 33 years later and appreciated once again his kindness from 1969. Our ship was still involved over in the Western Pacific, and I was counting the days till I could get off and report to the New Jersey because that seemed so much more exciting. The big day finally came in the middle of April when I was detached from Washoe County. Caught an airplane back to the United States, flew down to Southern California, met up with my brother, who was then on board USS Princeton, home ported in Long Beach. Spent a few days with him on board ship and went to the Navy Exchange to cash a check. And the woman behind the counter looked at my checkbook, and I'd already had New Jersey printed on the checks, and she said, "Your ship is not coming in." I was just astonished, wonder what she was talking about. She told me there was a connection with a U.S. reconnaissance aircraft that had been shot down by the North Koreans, and the New Jersey had been turned around to go build up naval force in the Sea of Japan. So at that point, there was no ship to report to, so I went back home, spent some time on leave. I came back out in the middle of May, and by that time I seen and read in the newspapers that the New Jersey had had a joyous homecoming from Vietnam. The crew members had gotten back with their families. So on the 20th of May, after spending a little time on board my brother's ship, reported aboard New Jersey. By that time, he had shifted to TAC transport, USS Talladega. So we had a good family reunion, and until he left to go to other duty, we saw each other practically every night, went on Liberty together, had a great time.
Tell me, why did both your brother and yourself join the Navy?
I think that probably can be attributed to our father, who was born back in 1912, and in around 1940, he had served as an officer in merchant ships on the Great Lakes, and he had told us so many stories about the pleasures he remembered from that. And he also had a friend who was in the local Naval Reserve Unit in Springfield, Missouri. And so he suggested to us that since we were eligible for the draft, that a way to perform our military service would be to join the Naval Reserve, which I did in 1962 and Mark did in 1963. The idea then was that we would drill as enlisted men during our undergraduate years in college, go to OCS in Newport, Rhode Island in the summers, and then once we got our degrees, we'd get commissioned and go on active duty as officers. And then we could retire after 20 years. And he sort of laid out this progression of how it would happen, and essentially it played out just according to the script. I wound up 30 years later retiring from the Naval Reserve in 1992.
You were serving off of Vietnam on an LST. Talk a little bit about your duty on the LST and what did you do there and the reaction of the crew to the Vietnam War at the time. And if you could explain that a bit.
I reported to the USS Washoe County LST 1165 in August of 1966. I had gotten my commission in June of that year, gone to some schools on the West Coast. Then the long flight to the Western Pacific. Washoe County was home ported in Yokosuka, Japan. And essentially, she was a support ship for the Vietnam War effort. We typically would go from Japan down to Okinawa, pick up a load of rolling stock in our tank deck and other war materials on the main deck, and effectively became a cargo ship. And the reason for Okinawa was that Japan couldn't be seen as directly supporting the Vietnam War. So we couldn't go directly from Japan to Vietnam. We had to make that intermediate stop in Okinawa. Then we would go down, and the LST had the capability of beaching, which was handy for the rolling stock. They could drive right off the front of the ship onto the beach. And I don't know how many times we went into Da Nang and Chu Lai, and then after we'd gotten there, we would take on a load of what was known as retrograde, and I suppose that's sort of a euphemism. It was essentially military junk, vehicles that had been wrecked or beaten up, empty drums, what have you. Then we would make the reverse trip from Vietnam to Okinawa, back to Japan. And so essentially for 2.5 years, I was over there continuously, except for a 1-month period of leave. And in 1 year, 1968, I think I was in Vietnam 9 months out of the 12. And we also got involved with amphibious ready groups. My brother's ship, Princeton, was in one of those groups. We had Marines on board. This is when we weren't carrying cargo. We would send them off by boat or by helicopter to go ashore in Vietnam. We did logistics runs from Da Nang up to the demilitarized zone, carried war materials up there. In the fall of 1968, we went down to the Delta area in southern tip of South Vietnam, and we got involved in Operation Sea Lords, which was under the command of Vice Admiral E.R. Zumwalt, who was later the Chief of Naval Operations. And It was a much more active type of naval combat than our in-country forces had been used to up to then. We were the mothership for a number of PCFs, which were the swift boats, armed with machine guns and mortars. We also supported WPBs, which were small Coast Guard cutters. We worked with minesweepers. We had two jobs, really. One was to intercept any North Vietnamese attempts to get war materials into South Vietnam. And the other thing was to launch these boats on river raids. And one day I went along on a swift boat raid, had a helmet on, a flak jacket, machine gun in hand. And as we went up the river, if we saw the enemy, we were prepared to shoot. As it happened, the enemy wasn't out that day, which was a blessing, because as we got partway up the river, we ran into a wooden barricade of fairly recent construction that had been built across the river. And it would have been a perfect ambush site, because the only way to get back out was to turn around. And while we were there, we could have been targets for machine gun fire. But we had some very touching experiences then. We sent in a couple of raids that did get ambushed. And I remember part of my job was to get on the radio with the forces ashore and let them know when we needed a medevac helicopter to come and pick up the wounded. And one day, a couple of years ago, I got an email, and so much of the spam email has misleading headlines to try to entice you into opening it up. And in this case, the headline was, "You were there on the 24th of November, 1968. And my immediate reaction was, well, I couldn't have been there because I was on board ship that day. But I opened it up anyway, and turned out that was the whole point of the email. It was from a former gunner's mate named Joe Ponder, lived down in Florida. And he had gotten the addresses for every former crew member he could find who was on board Washoe County in November 1968, and sent us the message that said, "Thank you for saving my life that day." He had been badly wounded. He got hit in the knee by a machine gun round. And essentially, as you looked at his leg, it looked as if a shark had taken a giant bite out of his knee. You could see the bones, you could see the muscle. He'd had a tourniquet applied. We called in the helicopter. He was lifted off. So was a lieutenant who had been hit in the leg. And years later, Joe Ponder told me that they had gotten over to the hospital ashore in Vietnam, and the lieutenant had been pleading with the doctors to save his leg, and they couldn't. I had the pleasure earlier this year of meeting Joe Ponder down in Norfolk, Virginia at a swift boat reunion. And he was walking on crutches because he's never had the full use of that leg again, but there was no bitterness. He accepted that as part of the price for serving his country in Vietnam. And instead, his emotion was one of great gratitude to us for what we had done to help him. And I was just touched by emotion, seeing him for the first time in 35 years and feeling a sense of kinship because just of our brief encounter that one day in November 1968. We did a number of other things in the Western Pacific. We went to the Philippines often, Subic Bay. We went on some naval exercises in Okinawa, Korea. We went to Taiwan. A couple times we went to Hong Kong for recreation visits for the crew. Those were just marvelous. The scenery is outstanding. The exotic atmosphere of Hong Kong, the mixture of Chinese and British. Got nice suits made there for $50 a piece. Got tailor-made shirts. Occasionally I would run into my brother. We went ashore, I remember in Manila one day and did some sightseeing. It was a busy time. It was fatiguing. During our time supporting Operation Sea Lords in the fall of 1968, the days were often 18 or 19 hours long, doing your regular work and standing watches, to the point that when we got back to our home port of Yokosuka in early 69, I came down with a case of mononucleosis and had to be hospitalized. And it was just exhaustion in my physical system. So I was in the hospital for a while, and then some recuperation before reporting back aboard ship.
Talk to me a little bit about the attitude of the crewmen and yourself towards the Vietnam War, since you were over there for such a long period of time. What did you pick up?
Our crew was very much in support of the Vietnam War effort, and I would say that had mostly to do with the timing. 1966 to 69 was still relatively early in a war that went on until 1973. And we very much believed in what we were doing. It got somewhat boring at times during the long periods at sea carrying the cargo. And it's not as glamorous carrying cargo as it is being in combat and shooting. I would say that morale was extremely high during the fall of 68 when we were supporting the Swift boats, because here was a sense that we were doing a real mission that could make a difference, that could kill off the enemy and support the U.S. war effort. I remember that the Democratic National Convention of 1968 was tumultuous, held in Chicago with the protests and the rioters and Mayor Daley and the police crackdowns. We didn't really get a sense of that because the news that came to us on board ship was highly filtered. It was in the Stars and Stripes, which is an armed forces newspaper, and not known for a diversity of editorial opinion. I would say we ironically, off the coast of Vietnam, were much more isolated from public sentiment than those in the United States. We didn't have a sense of the depth of the feeling against the war. I've heard from people who served in Vietnam in the early 70s, and by then there was a feeling of futility, but we did not have that.
Let's transition, if we can, from your service aboard the LST to your arrival on the Battleship New Jersey. Talk to us a little bit about your service on the New Jersey.
I suppose if I could encapsulate my New Jersey time in one word, would be thrilled. I was thrilled to be a part of something so big, so powerful, so beautiful, so much potential to help the war effort, because we had certainly heard the reports on how effective the New Jersey was in protecting American troops, providing gunfire support, and believing in the war. We certainly believed that we could make a contribution. I got aboard the ship in May, just after the first deployment. There was a bit of a stand down period for the crew, who had been through 6 or 7 month deployment, plus the extension to go over to the Sea of Japan after the airliner was shot down. And so it was kind of a relaxing period initially. I remember reporting to the operations office, and the first several weeks I just spent reading manuals and ship's instructions and how you do it and so forth. And as I recall, Liberty Call started at noon each day, just to make up for the crew, which had spent so many long days and nights at sea. And since I'd been over there on board another ship, I had no guilt feelings about getting off at as well. We got cheap tickets to go to Disneyland, as I remember, and my brother and I used to go to baseball games in San Diego and Dodger Stadium and what have you. And spent some time with Dick Harris from Springfield, Missouri, again, a friend I had developed since we were both from the same place. The first real test came about the 9th of June, as I recall. we got underway for training the crew, retraining the crew in some cases to prepare for the mission upcoming in Vietnam. We went out and steamed off San Clemente Island and were involved in fire support practices. And that was my first indoctrination in the Combat Information Center. I was to be there as the assistant CIC officer. Had about 50 radarmen that worked with me, and they had a variety of tasks in CIC. Back then it was in the fourth deck, down below the armored deck, and what apparently originally had been a 16-inch powder magazine when the ship was built. She was designed before the era of radar and CICs, and so that had been converted to the purpose. And I sort of have a vague recollection of some point when the ship was inactivated, seeing a comparable space on the port side. Ours was on the starboard, and that was still a 16-inch magazine. The forward main battery plotting room was just adjacent to CIC. We had a watertight door we could go through, and then the secondary battery plotting room for the 5-inch guns was nearby as well. And we would have a steady liaison and communication with the plotting rooms during a fire mission. The word would come in from outside, from the spotter, on what the coordinates were to be fired, and our team would go through checking the range, checking the bearing. And as I remember, there was a CCC Combat Something Center up in the 05 level that coordinated all this. And the idea was to have the coordinates match from all three locations, CCC, the plotting room, and CIC. And once that was accomplished, then we'd fire the missions. Unfortunately, during my time in the crew, I never got to see the 16-inch guns fire because I was down in the fourth deck, and it was sort of a muffled sound. It was not intense at all. And I really didn't get to see and hear those guns fire till 1983, when I spent a couple of weeks on board researching my book. And being on the bridge when turret 2 fired, which is the closest one to the bridge, was just an intense experience. You get kind of overwhelmed from the combination of the heat and the light and the noise and the concussion. And so often the word awesome is overused, but I think in that case it truly fits. And that was only one gun at a time. I've heard from people who were on board for multi-gun salvos or 9-gun salvos, and they said it's just an incredible experience. We also got practice going in and out of port on sea details. And my watch station, again, was down in CIC. And our job was to provide radar navigation backup for the navigation team up on the 08 level for going in and out of port. And so when we went into San Francisco later, for example, we would hear reports on the sound-powered phones from the lookouts. Oh, isn't that magnificent? There's the Golden Gate Bridge and all. And we're looking at a radar scope, which is somewhat less exciting. But I had a lot of admiration for the professionalism and skill of the radarmen who had the experience in most cases from the first deployment, and they were breaking me in on how to do this on board the battleship. We had one deployment while I was on board, a midshipman cruise. Started in June. We went up to Tacoma, Washington, spent a little time there. Went out to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. We were there for, I suppose, about 10 days. Intermediate to going to Tacoma. We stopped in Alameda, California, and had Liberty in San Francisco, which was interesting. I remember being in downtown San Francisco and seeing a man pedaling a bicycle, and he had long red hair caught up in a ponytail. And I had been gone from the country since 1966, and this was quite a culture shock for me. We had Rear Admiral Lloyd Vasey on board as commander of the Midshipman Squadron, and one night his flag lieutenant talked to me when I had quarterdeck watch, and he said we went out and the admiral's car was surrounded by protesters, and I guess they rocked the car or something. But this was so different from the America that I had left in 1966. It took me a little while to adjust to this new reality. San Francisco was great for liberty. One day we had general visiting, and there's a picture in my book of the crowd lined up, just hundreds of people standing in line for the chance to go on board the forward brow, walk from one end of the ship to the other, and go off the after brow. And I felt so excited to have the pleasure to be able to be on board ship every day. I think we had about 12,000 visitors in one day that just testified to the popularity and the appeal of the ship.
Did you run into any anti-war protesters while the people were aboard the ship? The reason I ask that question is at one port in California, one person mentioned that as some of the people who came aboard the ship that day, there were pasty anti-war stickers on the ship. Did you have any experiences with that?
The one day that we had the large amount of general visiting, I was ashore on Liberty, so I don't recall that at all. I do remember going up to Tacoma, and it was just beautiful. We were there over July 4th, and the ship was anchored out rather than being tied up to a pier, so we had to run boats back and forth. And I was the beach guard officer, and I would communicate by radio back and forth with the ship on how this visiting was going. And obviously you can have a lot fewer visitors when you have to transport each one by boat rather than just having them line up and go aboard. And I remember in particular early in the evening, there was a young woman in a miniskirt, and they were all the rage in the late 60s. And she went aboard the ship with a third-class petty officer, and people came, people went, time passed, and at 2200, which was time for taps, I called out to the ship on the radio and asked if all the visitors were ashore, and I was assured that the last boatloads had come in to us. Well, then sometime later, maybe a half hour or so later, here came Miss Miniskirt, and this time she was with a seaman rather than the third-class petty officer, and she looked considerably rumpled up. So I was with a few petty officers there standing the watch, and we had a little humorous speculation on what she might have been involved with on board ship, and concluded that she might have given new meaning to the word lower handling room. And that was an interesting trip. The men of the New Jersey had gone ashore in Liberty in these boats, and toward the evening they started drifting back, and a number of them were somewhat the worse for wear after having consumed some alcohol and gotten involved with whatever they were. And I remember in particular there was one kind of a burly petty officer, and he pointed up to me there on the dock, said, "Hey, you up there in the sailor suit, if you do things right, someday you'll grow up to be a battleship sailor." So he was obviously feeling no pain at that point.
How did the crew aboard the Battleship New Jersey compare to the crew on your LST?
The crew on board New Jersey was much larger. We had about 1,600 total officers and enlisted on board New Jersey, whereas we had maybe 110 or 120 on board the LST. There was such a larger reservoir of talent and experience on board the battleship. Our skipper on board the LST was either a lieutenant or lieutenant commander, whereas there was a captain in command of New Jersey, maybe 6 commanders, then a layer of lieutenant commanders and lieutenants, and comparable in the enlisted men, just a lot of chief petty officers, first class, and what have you. We seem to live in the LST, and this is not completely fair, but from emergency to emergency. We would deal with each crisis as it came along. The New Jersey seemed much more like the professional Navy, that things were well organized, they happened smoothly. Things had been done before, we just followed that pattern and went along. It was very gratifying to be a part of that. And it reminded me of a scene in Herman Wouk's novel, The Cane Mutiny. The mutineers were on board the Cane, which was a ragtag ship with a screwball skipper. And in the novel, they came to the New Jersey to put their skipper on report to Halsey. And they got on board and they looked up at the 16-inch guns on the forecastle. They looked up at the towering superstructure. They saw the 5-inch guns and all. And they said, "This is the real Navy. Nobody will believe us where we came from." Well, that's the feeling I had getting to the New Jersey. This is the real Navy, and I'm glad to be here.
Talk to me a little about the captain of the ship. Was it Captain Snyder?
There were 2 commanding officers on board New Jersey when I was here, and 2 distinctly different styles. Captain Ed Snyder was very outgoing. You'd call him swashbuckling, flamboyant, given to the grand gesture. He told the crew members that they didn't have to wear hats topside because the wind might just blow them off anyway. There was more a sense of informality. He had 2 of the empty 40-millimeter gun tubs up in the superstructure painted light blue inside. And he said those are the swimming pools. And there was even a picture in the cruise book that showed Ed Snyder on an air mattress floating around in the swimming pool filled with water. He demanded the highest in terms of professionalism. He demanded that the ship be clean. He was rigorous as far as gunfire accuracy and proper handling of the ammunition and so forth, but more of an informality about other things. And the crew loved him. He was interested in what they were doing. He might show up in the bake shop at 2 a.m. or the machine shop just to show by his presence and his personal interest that he cared about what the crew was doing. He got relieved on the 23rd of August, 1969 by Captain Bob Penniston, and his was an entirely different personality. He was very much by the book, not inclined to roam the ship. He would spend the time up on the bridge when the ship was underway, much more formal, certainly friendly, but you got the sense that he would deal with the hierarchy of the chain of command rather than showing up somewhere down in the crew's quarters and just shooting the breeze with people. The one thing that really symbolized for me the difference between the 2 was those swimming pools. I had the officer of the deck watch on the quarterdeck the evening of the change of command after the new skipper had taken over. So out of curiosity, I went up and looked in the gun tub that had been light blue that morning, and that night it was already painted gray inside. That told us that this was a traditional skipper. He was sorely disappointed, Captain Penniston was, that instead of taking the ship to Vietnam as expected, we would just be going up to Bremerton, Washington to put her in mothballs. And it was an emotional wrench to him because this had been his first ship he'd seen as a midshipman. It was the first ship he'd reported to as a commissioned officer. Now here he was at the apex of his career, called to command the ship, and he would command her for nothing more than a mothballing period. But he took the approach that it would be done as well and professionally and as thoroughly as it could be done, so that in the unlikely event that the ship ever got recommissioned, she would be in good shape for that.
What was the crew's reaction when they heard that the ship was going to be mothballed?
I remember that it was a disheartening day when Captain Snyder got on the 1MC one morning and said that he had received the news from Washington that New Jersey and dozens of other ships were about to be decommissioned. And Lieutenant Commander Tom Taylor was my boss. He was the CIC officer. And he had a pad of paper on his desk. And I recall he wrote "Bad Day at Black Rock" on the paper. And I think that reaction was felt by many, many in the crew. And in particular, there was a radioman named George Stavros who mounted a one-man letter writing campaign. And he sent these to congressmen and anybody else he could, trying to persuade them to reverse the decision. But at that point, it was irreversible.
Now, before you work as a historian for the Navy, why do you think the ship was decommissioned at that point?
The only reason we got, and I still believe it's the compelling one for the decision to decommission the New Jersey, was to save dollars, because the Navy was put in a big budget crunch just at that time, because Congress was listening to public opinion. The public was saying it was no longer interested in supporting the war. There would no longer be as many dollars available. And New Jersey was a big target because she had such a large crew. I don't think it was done to symbolize something in the Vietnam War. I think this was a reaction to budgetary pressures and the fact that so many other ships went out at the same time goes along with that, supports it. The other thing is that the Navy was asked to cut down dramatically on its personnel strength at the same time. Fewer ships, you need fewer people, that saves more dollars. And that hit me as well. I had put in the required time as an officer. And so Bureau of Personnel said essentially I could have two choices at that point. One was to be done with my active service and go home, or sign up for another 2-year sea tour at some other ship. And I just felt that after the New Jersey, any other ship would be anticlimactic. And so I opted just to let the system work and go back home. So on the 15th of October 1969, I was released from the New Jersey. At that point, we were in Bremerton, had been there since early September, just draining the life out of the ship, figuratively. Compartments were closed down, systems were closed down. And really, as a assistant CIC officer, there wasn't all that much for me to do, because that's a job that gets done at sea when the ship is operating. And we had done that in June and July and August for the midshipman crews, but you didn't need to operate the radars sitting in the shipyard at Bremerton. And so I stood a lot of officer of the deck, quarterdeck watches there.
Arnold, plane right, come to the quarterdeck.
Arnold,
plane right, come to the quarterdeck.
I had sort of make work jobs almost of going around inventorying the Title B equipage that was on board. How many floor buffers do we have? How many of this? How many of that? It was such a terrible letdown from what we expected to be doing, but there was no recourse. And so I got released from active duty about 2 months before the ship was decommissioned, but had such a sense of affection for the ship that I flew back out in December to Bremerton and was on board for the decommissioning ceremony on the 17th of December. And that was just a very sad occasion. We felt at the time, not only was this the end of our ship, this was the end of the battleship era that had started back in 1895 when the first battleships were commissioned. And it was an overcast, rainy day in Bremerton, and that sort of symbolized it. I remember the day before, I'd been to a rehearsal, and Captain Peniston had gone through his speech, and he said he hoped he didn't break down during the ceremony, because it was such an emotional thing, and because it was such a contrast with what he wanted to do and what he had expected to do. And so we had taps, we had the closing out of the ship's log, the crew filed off by the brow, and Captain Peniston was the last one off. And there was a picture that was reproduced in newspapers around the country right after that showed him bringing a gloved hand up to quell the tears he felt from how sad he was. And I wound up using that picture in the book, and he has dubbed it, quote, the picture, unquote. And all he has to say is that, and I know exactly what he means.
After your life aboard the battleship comes to a close, as you look back on the battleship years later, how did the battleship affect your life?
I want to add one more postscript about service on board. The person that I felt the most warmth from was Commander Jim Elfelt, the executive officer. And traditionally in a ship with the captain and the exec, the captain's the good guy and the exec's the bad guy, the hard ass, the enforcer, the disciplinarian. Elfelt was not like that. He was a very friendly, warm, outgoing person, and people felt just so much respect for him that they did what they were supposed to without his having to be difficult about it. I just treasured the times that I spent with him. He was down to earth, not pompous, not condescending at all. And he put a note in the plan of the day for the decommissioning day, December 17th. And it said, if any of the shipmates ever find yourselves in the same port as I am, please look me up and say hello. And that was not any kind of a hollow gesture on his part. A number of years later, I was working in the Naval Institute in Annapolis, and in walks, by then, Rear Admiral Jim Elfelt in his whites with his gold shoulder boards, not standing on ceremony at all. He said, I just wanted to say hello to a former shipmate. And that makes you feel so good. He was the kind of guy that you would follow anywhere. Snyder was as well. And to have that kind of leadership just reinforced the feeling I had being on board the ship. There were interesting effects later. In the fall of 1969, I was back in Springfield, Missouri. I got a letter from a friend whom I'd been in college with, and by then he was a graduate student at the University of Minnesota. And there was a public bus strike in Minneapolis, and he wound up taking a woman from the same apartment building to work each day at the University of Minnesota. She was the journalism librarian, and he knew that I planned to go into journalism. So he wrote me a letter. I think his wife put him up to it and said, well, you've got to meet this girl named Karen McKenzie at the University of Minnesota. So I went up to Minneapolis from Missouri, 600 miles for a blind date. That was in December 69, and in August of 1970, Karen and I got married, and we've been married ever since. So I've reflected on fate and circumstance and luck and what have you, that I very likely never would have met her had the ship been off the coast of Vietnam in 69 as scheduled. So you never know what's around that next corner. But the New Jersey time really changed my life, because after the Washoe County, I had pretty much a negative feeling about the Navy. It had not been enjoyable. There had been a lot of duress, difficult combat experience. I felt very positive about the Navy just after 5 months in New Jersey. It changed my attitude so much. My last official day of active duty in the Navy was the 22nd of October, 1969. On the 23rd, I got a call from the local Naval Reserve recruiter and said, you want to come back and start drilling again? So I did. drilling there. I subsequently drilled in St. Louis when I lived there, in and around the Washington area, and wound up with 30 total years in the Naval Reserve from the first time I had enlisted. I also, in early 1970, started in journalism school at the University of Missouri, and this had been my original objective all along, to become a sports writer. And at that point, I just saw the Navy as one stop in the road, or one sign that had to get past to get on to the rest of my life. Well, when I got to university, I was working on a master's degree and searching for a topic for my thesis. And working with the advisor, I hit upon the idea of doing one on the public relations and the news media coverage of the New Jersey during this Vietnam period. So I wound up interviewing former crew members, people such as Captain Snyder, Commander Elfelt, the public affairs officer, went into the news clips from a number of newspapers, got some TV transcripts, PBS, and try to look at the interaction between what the Navy was saying on the one hand and what the media was publishing on the other. During the course of this, I needed to get together a thesis committee at the university, and my advisor said I needed one naval officer because of the subject matter. So I was a member of the Naval Institute by that time, and as it happened, one issue of the Proceedings magazine came out, and the author of the article was Captain Paul Schratz, who was a retired submariner, and his bio said that he was teaching at the University of Missouri in St. Louis. So I got in touch with Captain Schratz and asked him if he would be on my thesis committee, visited him. He said he was sorry he couldn't because he was going to be moving to Annapolis, Maryland. Well, by coincidence, my wife Karen and I took sort of a second honeymoon in Annapolis and just loved the area. So when I was between jobs in 1974, I sent a batch of resumes to Captain Schratz and said, please spread these around wherever they might do any good. And as it happened, there was an opening with the Naval Institute Proceedings at that time. I had both journalism and Navy background, where I guess the other candidates had one or the other. So I got hired, and I've been there ever since. And I am sure that I would not have wound up at the Naval Institute if not for that connection with the New Jersey thesis and Captain Schratz. So it changed my life.
So once you arrived at the Naval Institute, talk to us a little bit about how you go about your work today, how you move into the field of oral history, and how you've organized a collection.
I got into oral history really by accident. The first 7 or so years I was at the Naval Institute, I was one of the editors on our monthly Proceedings magazine. We had one man doing oral history, Dr. Jack Mason, and with my interest in history, I talked to him quite a bit. And he showed me the techniques, and I had done a number of interviews for my master's thesis in journalism, and I guess I hadn't heard the term oral history at the time, but that's essentially what it was. And so I'd gotten some background in doing the interviews and transcribing and what have you. And so I became somewhat of an understudy to Dr. Mason, and when he passed the word that he was going to retire in 1982, I was asked if I would take over for him, and I was pleased and delighted with the opportunity. And since that time, probably have averaged 40 or so interviews a year, and when you multiply that by now 21 years, it adds up. The approach we use is to do, in most cases, a full biographical treatment of the individual, starting with childhood, going through Naval Academy or whatever, the active service, retirement, getting really a full picture, and that way the individual has undoubtedly been involved in dozens of different things, and potentially those are the topics that are going to be researched subsequently. So we put in a very thorough index. We transcribe the audio tapes and then edit them, let the interviewee have a chance to go back and correct mistakes and fill in names and what have you. Then do a thorough index as a retrieval guide. So if somebody wants to know about USS Enterprise, the World War II aircraft carrier, we may have a dozen people who talked about that, and we can pull those pieces out of the dozen different transcripts and make those available. Or maybe somebody wants to work on the newer Enterprise, the nuclear-powered carrier, so we can do that. We've been really gratified in some of the ways in which the material has been used. I did one set of programs with the first black naval officers commissioned in 1944, the Golden 13. I started on the interviews in 1986, at which time there were 8 of the 13 still alive. And their stories were so dramatic. James Hare, for example, told about being present down in Florida in the mid-30s when his brother-in-law, Estes Wright, was killed by a mob, essentially because he would not back down to white people in Florida. And James Hare, for a while, as I sat and talked to him, was literally speechless because the pain of that memory was so intense. And he said he heard the last dying gasps of his brother-in-law's life. And he put his hands on Wright's face, and the bone structure was just gone because he had been beaten so brutally. And yet he took from that the positive, because Estes Wright had taught him about handling small boats and watercraft and what have you. James Hare went into the Navy, became a petty officer, worked on a tugboat crew, got his commission, and had his own tugboat command. Handled it so skillfully that he became the first black officer in the USS Mason, a destroyer escort that had black sailors and white officers. And then after I'd interviewed him and several others, I put them together in a book that was published in 1993 called The Golden 13. And after it came out, I got a call from a man in Florida who identified him as the son of Estes Wright, the man who had been lynched. And he said he learned things from reading the book that he had never known because their mother was such a strong Christian that she never told the children how their father had died because she didn't want them to grow up hating white people. And that just had such a tremendous impact that anybody could feel like that when you would expect just the opposite. I interviewed a man named George Cooper who had grown up in the South, and he said discrimination was a way of life. You expected to be treated shabbily. And yet when he became an officer, he became a missionary trying to cultivate the white sailors and say, I'm a fellow human being. I'm not some black son of a bitch with shoulder boards. And he won a lot of them that way. And I just had great respect for this man. I've interviewed a number of individuals who had unusual or outstanding accomplishments. Dennis Wilkinson, the first skipper of the Nautilus, the first nuclear-powered submarine. David McCampbell, who was the Navy's top fighter ace in World War II. Admiral Zumwalt, who really changed the social contract between the sailors and the Navy as a whole. I feel so privileged to be able to get these stories from the horse's mouths, to do exactly what you're doing, to record it while it's available so that it can be useful later on when it's needed.
What did you learn about the Navy as a result of your work as an oral historian of the Navy?
The thing that has struck me most is the diversity, and I don't use that in the term that it's most commonly used as far as racial diversity, but there are so many facets to the Navy, ranging from the big aircraft carriers with 6,000 people on board down to tiny ships that have crews of only a dozen. There's minesweeping, bombing, electronics, submarines, just across such a wide spectrum that any number of different people can find their niches, and that it's an organization that has promoted social change with Harry Truman's racial integration. There have been so many scientific changes, and yet it's a combination of people and equipment, because you've got to have the people to make all these fantastic machines do their job, to have the imagination and the skill to make things work. It's fascinating to see the changes over the years. The oldest person I talked to, it wasn't a formal interview, but more of a visit, was Rear Admiral Walter Stratton Anderson, who graduated from the Naval Academy in the class of 1903. And I talked to him in the 1970s when he was in his 90s. And he remembered that when he got out of the Naval Academy, some of the senior officers on board ships were veterans of the Civil War. And certainly Spanish-American war veterans were numerous at that time. And here he was, more than 70 years after his graduation, just racked with arthritis, and yet there was still a sparkle as he thought about the Navy he'd served in. His story demonstrated the importance of timing and circumstance. He had been an up-and-coming admiral. He was the type commander for the battleships at Pearl Harbor, was on board the Maryland when they were hit. And essentially that was the end of his career, because anybody who was associated with the battleships at Pearl Harbor didn't have a professional future. And so he didn't get the top kind of jobs. Despite the arthritis, he had a will that he was going to live to be 100 years old. And about 3 weeks after his 100th birthday, he died. And in that sense, he had completed what he thought was his last mission.
One final question. We have about 3 minutes left on the tape. The battleship. You're the expert on the battleship. What role could the battleships play today, if any, or are the battleships just outdated?
The role, if any, in the future for the battleships would be to provide heavy gunfire support with the 16-inch guns. That was the specialty that set them apart, set the New Jersey apart in Vietnam and the others in the 1980s. I would be very surprised if any do get recommissioned, just because they have such large crews, and the defense budget has gotten tighter and tighter. And then you add the fact that the hulls are literally 60 years old, and a number of the systems are that old. It would be useful to get some modern ship design now with the latest technology that could perform that mission. As it is, they have a rich and colorful heritage, and I'm just so proud to have been part of that, even if for a brief time.
Now, is there any final question I should have asked, Paul, that I haven't? You have about 2 minutes on it that you'd like to speak on from the record.
Well, I had such a strong feeling about the New Jersey that when the word came in the early 80s that she was going to be reactivated, I put in a proposal to write a history of the ship, and in fact wound up doing that. The book was published in 1986. And the neatest part of it was going back and talking to former crew members from all the different eras, interviewing all the former skippers who were still alive. And I would call up somebody out of the blue who didn't know me from Adam tell him I was a former New Jersey crew member, and within a minute we were like old friends. It was like we had dated the same girl and we wanted to compare our recollections. And it's just been such an honor to be able to put that story together and make it available for others.
Good. Well, thank you. Today I'm going to talk with Mr. Paul Stillwell. It is June 13th, the year 2003. My name is Dr. Tom Bennett from Kane University's Oral History Project with Battleship New Jersey. Paul, thank you very, very much. Thank you.
I'm flattered.
Is there anything else you want to say?
No.
Okay. It's hot. It's been a long time to be done with it. Thank you very much.